right now, as you listen to this, your brain is sitting there consuming roughly 20% of your body's total energy.
Yeah, it's a massive, relentless metabolic drain.
Exactly. But here's the really strange part. If I asked you to suddenly, I don't know, calculate the square root of 1,444 in your head, the energy consumption of your brain would barely tick up at all.
No, we're talking about an increase of, well, less than 5%.
Less than 5%, which presents this really profound neurobiological paradox.
Right, because if intense active cognitive effort requires such a negligible fraction of the brain's energy budget, then, well, what exactly is the other 95% of that vast energy expenditure actually doing while you're simply sitting there?
And today we are going to be looking at exactly that, those invisible deep currents of the mind. Welcome to this deep dive.
It's great to be here to unpack this.
If you're listening to this, you are likely a psychiatry trainee, maybe a registrar, or a clinician who's deep into your reading. And we've designed this specifically as a companion to Chapter 1.28 of Kaplan and Seidock's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
Absolutely. It's a dense chapter, but an essential one.
It really is. Now, our anchor for this entire discussion is a really fundamental principle, and that is psychiatry is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact and how that exact process can go wrong.
Spot on. And to understand how it goes wrong, we really have to update our clinical mental models. We have to shift our focus from the historical pursuit of localizing structural brain lesions.
The sort of where of mental illness.
Exactly, the where. We need to move from that to understanding functional connectivity, which is the how.
I always find it helpful to visualize the brain not as a collection of, isolated islands, but as a bustling global transit network.
That's a brilliant metaphor, actually.
Right. Because mental health isn't just about whether an individual train station is physically intact. It's about whether the trains are actually running on time, whether the major international hubs are communicating, and, well, whether the network can adapt to a sudden influx of passengers.
Quite. And psychopathology emerges when that transit network becomes overly rigid, or when trains get stuck in a continuous loop, or even when the entire routing system just collapses.
So our mission today is to understand how these intrinsic networks operate, how we actually measure them mathematically, and how their disruption manifests in very specific clinical realities like schizophrenia and major depression.
So let's begin by contextualizing this shift.
Right.
If we look back to the origins of modern biological psychiatry, sort of in the 1950s and the subsequent decades, the field was dominated by a highly reductionist view.
Right.
When early neuroimaging technologies like positron emission tomography, PE scans, and SPECT first allowed researchers to look inside the living brain, the clinical approach was largely inherited directly from classical neurology.
The classic lesion model. Like if a patient has a stroke in Broca's area and loses the ability to produce speech, you just link that specific tissue damage directly to the clinical deficit.
Exactly. It's very satisfying.
It is. It gives the clinician a physical target to point to. You can say, here is the broken bit.
It is deeply satisfying, but it fundamentally misled early psychiatric neuroimaging. Because researchers will put a patient with, say, schizophrenia into a scanner and have them perform a working memory task.
Oh.
And when the scanner detected abnormal activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, the conclusion was just immediate. They'd say the DLPFC is the site of the pathology. It was a search for the psychiatric equivalent of a broken bone.
I'm sort of stuck on the mechanics of that assumption, though. If a patient with depression shows a hyperactive amygdala during an emotion processing task, isn't it entirely logical to assume the amygdala tissue itself is the source of the problem?
Well, it's logical, yes, but it's incomplete, because it assumes the amygdala is operating in a complete vacuum. What early researchers failed to account for is that activity in any individual brain region is the downstream result of dynamic, coordinated inputs from across the entire neural axis. I mean, what if the prefrontal cortex tissue in a depressed patient is perfectly healthy, and the amygdala tissue is structurally intact, but the regulatory communication track between them has simply failed?
So the local station is completely fine, but the incoming signals are just garbled nonsense.
Precisely. And that realization really marked the paradigm shift from localization to connectivity. We had to stop asking which region is broken and begin asking, how is the communication between regions failing?
And the catalyst for this entirely new way of thinking arrived quite unexpectedly, didn't it? Back in 1995, through the work of Parag Biswal.
It did, yes.
I really want to spend some time on Biswal's discovery of resting state functional connectivity because it essentially flipped the neuroscience world on its head. What exactly was the dogma at the time, and what did he do differently?
Right, so the prevailing dogma in the mid-90s was entirely task-centric. You put someone in an fMRI scanner, you give them a stimulus like, I don't know, tapping their fingers, and you measure the resulting change in the blood oxygen level dependent, or BOLD signal.
And just to clarify for everyone, the BOLD signal measures the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated blood, which acts as our proxy for neural activity, right?
Exactly. But crucially, any background fluctuation in that BOLD signal when the patient was not doing the task was considered physiological noise. It was assumed to be scanner drift or heartbeat or respiration. It was just discarded.
They literally just filtered it out of the data.
They threw it away entirely.
Mm.
But Biswal decided to look at that noise. He examined the brains of subjects who were simply lying still in the scanner, doing absolutely nothing.
Just resting.
Yes. And he focused on very slow, low-frequency, spontaneous fluctuations in the BOLD signal, specifically in the frequency band of 0.01 to 0.10 hertz.
So roughly one cycle every 10 to 100 seconds. That is an incredibly slow rhythmic pulse.
Extremely slow. And when he extracted the time course of those slow fluctuations from the left motor cortex, he made this startling observation.
What did he see?
Those random-looking, noisy fluctuations perfectly correlated with the spontaneous fluctuations occurring in the right motor cortex. The two regions were rising and falling together in perfect statistical synchrony, even though the subject was entirely at rest.
Wow. And this brings us right back to that 20% energy expenditure we mentioned at the start of the deep dive. These deep, slow currents, these intrinsic resting state networks, are what the brain is spending all its metabolic energy actually maintaining.
Yes. The brain is never truly at rest.
Hmm.
It is constantly active, constantly maintaining its functional architecture and its state of readiness. Engaging in a cognitive task is merely a slight, temporary perturbation of this massive underlying intrinsic organization.
So trying to understand the neurobiology of the mind by only looking at task-based fMRI is sort of like trying to understand the mechanics of the ocean by only measuring the white caps on the waves while remaining completely ignorant of the deep global currents driving the entire system.
That captures the magnitude of the paradigm shift perfectly. And over the last 2 decades, researchers have mapped these deep currents with astonishing precision.
It's incredible how far the field has come.
It really is. We now know that these resting state networks map almost perfectly onto the networks we use during active tasks, and their functional architecture begins to emerge incredibly early in neurodevelopment. I mean, even before birth.
Okay, let's unpack the major intrinsic networks. For a clinician listening to this, trying to build a mental model of psychopathology, what are the primary networks they really need to understand?
We can categorize them broadly by their functional domains. The most widely discussed is obviously the default mode network, or DMN.
Right, the DMN. Let's start there.
Anatomically, this network is anchored by the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the precuneus, alongside the angular gyrus.
Clinically speaking, though, what is the DMN actually doing on a day-to-day basis?
It governs our internal narrative. The DMN is highly active when we're engaged in self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory retrieval, daydreaming, and theory of mind, which is the ability to imagine the mental states of others. It's really the network of the internal self.
It's like the brain's screensaver.
Yes, exactly.
But presumably, we can't spend all our time in an internal narrative.
Right.
If I'm driving a car and suddenly a pedestrian steps into the road, I need to instantly drop my daydream and focus on the external world.
And that transition is critical. For adaptive, healthy mental function, the DMN must rapidly deactivate when attention is required for an externally demanding cognitive task. As we'll see later, a failure of the DMN to properly quiet down is a central feature in several psychiatric disorders.
So what networks actually take over when the DMN switches off?
That is the domain of the cognitive control and executive networks. Primarily, we look at the frontal parietal network and the cinguloatricular network.
Let's break those down. What does the frontal parietal network do?
The frontal parietal network, which heavily involves the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal cortex, is responsible for active cognitive control, working memory, and complex problem solving. It basically provides top-down regulation.
And the cinguloatricular network, what's its role?
That network, which is anchored by the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, is heavily involved in maintaining task sets, error monitoring, and emotion regulation.
Okay, so together, these systems kind of apply the brakes to our impulses and keep our behavior aligned with our goals.
Exactly.
Right, so we have the internal self-reflection network, the DMN, and the external task management networks. But there has to be a mechanism that decides when to switch between them, surely. How does the brain know when a stimulus is important enough to warrant dropping the daydream and engaging the executive control?
That routing function is largely attributed to the salience network.
The salience network.
Okay. The salience network comprises the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. Its primary function is to constantly scan the internal and external environment, identify novel, threatening, or highly rewarding stimuli, and then coordinate a neural response.
So it's sort of acting as a switchboard operator.
Yes, dynamically toggling the balance between the DMN and the executive networks depending on what is most relevant at any given millisecond.
The switchboard operator. That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. So we have the DMN, the executive control networks, and the salience network. Now, for the clinician reading the literature, understanding the networks is really only half the battle. They also need to understand how we actually measure these invisible lines of communication.
Absolutely. The methodology is key.
Let's move into the mechanisms and models of measuring connectivity. How do we actually see this stuff?
Well, the clinical literature relies on several distinct imaging modalities, each with its own physical limitations and trade-offs. The absolute workhorse of functional connectivity is fMRI.
Let's break down the physics of fMRI for a moment, because it dictates exactly how we interpret the clinical data. We aren't actually measuring electrical impulses between neurons, are we?
No, not at all. We were measuring a hemodynamic proxy.
Blood flow.
Exactly. When a population of neurons fires, it consumes oxygen. A few seconds later, the brain compensates by flooding that local capillary bed with oxygen-rich blood. Because oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin have different magnetic properties. Deoxygenated hemoglobin is paramagnetic and disrupts the magnetic field. The MRI scanner can detect this change in the ratio. This is the BLD signal.
Which means fMRI has incredible spatial resolution. We can pinpoint activity down to a 2 millimeter voxel deep in the subcortex, but the temporal resolution, the timing of it, is painfully slow.
Painfully slow. Neural firing happens in milliseconds. But the peak of the hemodynamic response function, the blood rushing in, happens 4 to 6 seconds later. It is a highly blurred, sluggish signal over time.
So if you want exquisite temporal resolution to measure the actual electrical oscillations, you'd have to use electroencephalography, EEG, or magnetoencephalography, Meg?
You would. But the trade-off there is spatial depth. EEG is fantastic for tracking millisecond by millisecond changes on the cortical surface, but it really struggles to accurately localize signals from deep subcortical structures like the amygdala or the striatum.
And those are obviously critical in psychiatry.
Absolutely essential. To get both high spatial and high temporal resolution, you'd have to use electrocorticography or ECOG.
Which requires surgically implanting electrode grids directly onto the surface of the brain, right?
Yes, highly invasive. The data is unparalleled, but we are entirely limited to studying patients undergoing brain surgery for conditions like intractable epilepsy.
Right. Which brings us back to fMRI as the dominant non-invasive tool. Now, practically speaking, gathering resting state data requires a patient to lie perfectly still in a dark, noisy tube for 10 to 20 minutes without falling asleep.
Which is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, for a healthy volunteer, that is tedious. But for a hyperactive 7-year-old or a patient actively experiencing paranoia, it seems practically impossible.
It is a massive barrier to translational research, and this is exactly why the field is rapidly adopting naturalistic paradigms, specifically movie-watching fMRI.
Wait, they are putting patients in the scanner and just playing a film.
Yes, quite literally.
But how does that give you resting state intrinsic connectivity? Doesn't the movie activate specific visual and auditory tasks?
It does, but movie watching drives the brain through a rich, synchronized sequence of naturalistic states. Crucially, because the patient is entertained and engaged, head movement plummets. They stay awake, and their anxiety decreases significantly. We can then use advanced computational algorithms to filter out the shared stimulus-driven activity, the parts of the brain responding directly to the movie, and extract the underlying intrinsic functional connectivity architecture. It turns out that naturalistic viewing preserves, and sometimes even enhances, the reliability of individual network measurements compared to traditional quiet rest.
That is a remarkable methodological pivot. Okay, so regardless of whether the patient is resting or watching a film, the scanner outputs this massive, terrifyingly complex matrix of numbers. How do researchers turn billions of data points into a map of, say, the salience network?
There are a few primary analytic dimensions you'll encounter in the literature. The most classical approach is seed-based analysis, sometimes called region of interest analysis.
This sounds very hypothesis-driven.
It is entirely hypothesis-driven. You define a specific anatomical seed region in advance, say the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. You extract the average time course of the BOLD signal from that specific region, and then you run a simple statistical correlation across every other voxel in the brain.
Basically asking the algorithm, which other areas of the brain are fluctuating in synchrony with my seed region?
Exactly.
But isn't there a massive inherent bias there? I like to think of this as the street lamp problem.
The street lamp problem.
Yeah, if I drop my keys in a dark alley, but I only search under the street lamp on the corner because the light is better, I am never going to find what I'm looking for. If a researcher pre-selects the amygdala as their seed, they are absolutely guaranteeing that their entire connectivity map will be centered on the amygdala. They might be completely blind to a crucial network failure happening between, say, the insula and the parietal lobe.
That is the exact limitation of seed-based analysis.
Yeah.
It assumes the brain operates in simple, bivariate, pairwise connections.
Mm-hmm.
It completely ignores the multivariate reality of the brain. To see the whole picture without a priori bias, we use data-driven approaches, the most prominent being independent component analysis, or ICA.
Right. ICA. I have read this term constantly in papers, but the mathematics of it are quite daunting. How does it actually work in practice?
Think of it as the cocktail party problem applied to the brain.
Okay.
Imagine you're in a room with 50 different conversations happening simultaneously, and you have microphones scattered around the room recording the chaotic, blended audio. Independent component analysis is a blind source separation algorithm. It takes that massive blended data set and mathematically unmixes it into statistically independent sources.
So the algorithm looks at the sheer chaos of the whole brain BOLD signal and naturally separates it into the isolated tracks. It just hands you the DMN on one track, the visual network on another, and the salience network on another, without you ever having to tell it where to look.
Exactly. It decomposes the data into spatial maps of covering networks. The difficulty for the researcher is that the algorithm has absolutely no biological intelligence.
Ah.
It might output 40 independent components, and the researcher then has to determine which ones represent true neural networks and which ones just represent the patient's breathing or heartbeat or scanner noise.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, whether we use seed-based or ICA, we are essentially just looking at correlations, right? We're just saying region A and region B fluctuate together.
Yes.
But correlation doesn't tell us directionality. It doesn't tell us if A is driving B or if B is driving A.
That is a vital distinction in clinical reasoning. To infer causality, researchers have to use effective connectivity models, such as Granger causality or dynamic causal modeling.
Dynamic causal modeling, DCM.
Yes. DCM uses Bayesian mathematical frameworks to test specific hypotheses about the hidden neural states causing the observed fMRI signals. It tries to establish the hierarchical direction of information flow. It's computationally incredibly demanding, but it allows us to ask questions like, is the prefrontal cortex actively suppressing the amygdala or the amygdala overriding the prefrontal cortex?
Okay, we need to introduce one final analytical framework because it underpins how we understand the collapse of networks in major psychiatric illnesses. Let's talk about graph theory.
Yes, graph theory. It wasn't actually developed for neuroscience. It's a branch of mathematics dedicated to the study of networks. It's used to model everything from the internet to global shipping routes.
So if we lean into that transit map metaphor we used earlier, if we apply graph theory to the brain, the anatomical brain regions, the individual train stations are called nodes, and the functional connections between those regions, the train tracks, are called edges.
Exactly. And using that framework, we can calculate the topological properties of the entire brain. We look at metrics like global efficiency.
Global efficiency. Right, so in a transit system, that would be how fast a passenger can travel from any one station to any other station across the entire map. If there are direct high-speed rails everywhere, global efficiency is high. If you have to make 6 transfers on local trains to cross the city, global efficiency is low.
Spot on. In the brain, high global efficiency means information can be rapidly integrated across widely distributed networks. We also measure local efficiency, which represents the fault tolerance of a specific neighborhood.
Like, if a major station goes offline, are there enough interconnected local stations to route the traffic around the failure?
Precisely. And some nodes are obviously more important than others. A local bus stop is not doing the same work as a major international airport.
Right, so how do we measure that importance?
We quantify that importance using a metric called the participation coefficient. Nodes with a high participation coefficient are connected to multiple, diverse networks. We call these regions hubs. The anterior insula, the precuneus, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are all major hubs. They integrate and distribute information across the entire brain.
And when these major hubs wire together, they form something called the Rich Club.
The Rich Club, yes, it's an elite, highly interconnected backbone of hubs. Think of it as a high-speed rail network connecting the major capitals. It is biologically expensive to maintain, but it's absolutely essential for complex, adaptive human cognition. When the Rich Club degrades, the entire cognitive architecture begins to fragment.
Before we move into the specific clinical disorders, I want to address a massive methodological trap that you warned me about regarding fMRI literature, something that could lead a clinician to read a paper and draw entirely the wrong neurobiological conclusion.
You're referring to the confound of participant head movement. This is arguably the most insidious artifact in resting state fMRI.
Yeah. How does simply moving your head invalidate the data? I mean, surely they account for that.
Well, imagine comparing a group of healthy controls to a group of patients with severe schizophrenia or a cohort of children with ADHD. The clinical population will inherently move their heads more inside the scanner. For years, researchers assumed this movement just added random background noise.
Just general blurriness.
Right. But we now know it creates a highly systematic, distance-dependent artifact.
Distance-dependent. What does that mean mathematically?
The physics of the movement artifact systematically distorts the Bolde signal in a way that artificially inflates the correlation between voxels that are physically close together while simultaneously deflating the correlation between voxels that are physically far apart.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm grasping the clinical implication of this. If a researcher does not aggressively correct for this movement artifact, their data will show that the clinical patients have hyperconnected local networks and a severe deficit in long-range global connections.
Exactly. And for years, highly prestigious journals published papers claiming that disorders like autism or schizophrenia were fundamentally characterized by local overconnectivity and global underconnectivity.
When in reality, it was just because the patients were fidgeting in the scanner.
In many cases, yes, absolutely. Once rigorous mathematical scrubbing techniques were applied to remove the micro-movements, those sweeping network deficits just vanished. It is a vital lesson for anyone reading neuroimaging literature. If the authors did not meticulously control for head motion, any finding regarding functional connectivity is highly suspect.
That is a brilliant caveat. Always check the methods section. All right, we have built the conceptual framework. We understand intrinsic networks, we know how fMRI works, and we have our graph theory transit map. Let's transition from the mechanism to the manifestation. I want to look at a clinical scenario.
Excellent.
Imagine a patient, let's call him patient M. He is 22 years old, experiencing a prodromal psychotic episode. He presents with profound sensory overload. He can't walk into a supermarket because the hum of the fluorescent lights, the colors of the packaging, and the overlapping conversations are completely overwhelming.
A very classic presentation.
Right. He is also exhibiting disorganized thought processes, struggling to hold a coherent conversation, and he's beginning to hear auditory verbal hallucinations. Historically, we might look for a lesion, but using our functional connectivity models, how do we explain this reality fracture of schizophrenia?
When we view schizophrenia through the lens of connectivity, we're actually validating some of the oldest clinical intuitions in psychiatry. I mean, over a century ago, pioneers like Carl Wernicke and Eugen Bleuler proposed that schizophrenia was fundamentally a disconnection syndrome.
They observed the fragmentation of thought and effect and just deduced that the different domains of the mind were no longer communicating.
Exactly. And decades later, Nancy Andreessen formalized this into her theory of cognitive dysmetria, suggesting a failure in the circuitry connecting the cortex, the thalamus, and the cerebellum. And modern fMRI has shown us exactly where that disconnection is happening.
So where is the epicenter?
The epicenter of the network failure repeatedly lands on the thalamus. The thalamus is not just a passive relay station, it is the grand routing center of the brain. Virtually all sensory information, with the exception of olfaction, must pass through the specific nuclei of the thalamus, where it's gated and directed to the cortex for higher level processing.
It also mediates massive coracostriatal thalamocortical loops that govern motor control and cognition, doesn't it?
It does.
So what happens to the thalamic transit hub in a patient like M?
We see a profound dual miswiring. It is a highly specific topographic disruption. First, individuals with schizophrenia show a severe reduction in functional connectivity between the thalamus, specifically the mediadorsal and anterior nuclei, and the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, and the striatum.
Let's map that to patient M's symptoms. Prefrontal cortex is the executive control center. It plans, it organizes, it filters. If the grand relay space in the thalamus loses its connection to the prefrontal cortex, the raw data of the world cannot be contextualized or organized.
Exactly.
So the cognitive disorganization and executive dysfunction we see in schizophrenia are a direct result of this disconnect.
Precisely. The executive command center is flying blind. But that is only the first half of the miswiring. Simultaneously, we see a pathological increase in connectivity between the thalamus and the primary sensory and motor areas, the somatosensory cortex, the auditory cortex, and the visual cortex.
Oh, the mechanism there is devastating. The relay station is disconnected from the filters, but hyper-connected to the raw sensory receivers.
Exactly. If we return to patient M in the supermarket, we can completely understand his experience. His brain is flooded with unedited, ungated sensory signals. The primary cortices are receiving massive input, but because the thalamus cannot communicate with the prefrontal cortex, the brain cannot deploy top-down attention to filter out the irrelevant noise.
Everything is salient. Everything is overwhelming.
Yes, the routing system has completely inverted.
And this isn't just a consequence of having the disease for decades, is it? It's not just brain atrophy over time.
No, and this is where it becomes translationally crucial. This specific thalamocortical miswiring is present in medication-naive first-episode patients. It is not an artifact of antipsychotic medication. Furthermore, we see it in clinical high-risk individuals, like patient M in his prodromal phase. In longitudinal studies, the degree of thalamic disconnectivity strongly predicts which high-risk individuals will subsequently convert to full-blown psychosis. It is a core neurobiological vulnerability.
I want to focus on patient M's auditory hallucinations for a moment. Hearing voices. If the default mode network governs our internal narrative and self-referential thought, my initial clinical reasoning would be that hallucinations are simply an overactive DMN.
That makes sense intuitively.
Right. The internal monologue just gets turned up so loud the patient thinks someone else is in the room. Is that what the connectivity data actually shows?
It is a highly intuitive hypothesis, and it actually dominated the early literature.
Yeah.
But the actual mechanism is much more complex. When we look specifically at patients with severe auditory verbal hallucinations, we do not simply see an overactive DMN. Instead, we see reduced functional connectivity between key nodes of the DMN, such as the temporoparietal junction and midline cortical structures, and the brain's broader language and auditory networks.
Reduced? Why would reduced communication cause a hallucination? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, it represents a failure of integration and source monitoring. Healthy cognition requires our brain to constantly tag internal thoughts as self-generated.
Okay, so a subconscious stamp saying, I thought this.
Exactly. If the network generating the internal narrative loses its communicative link with the language processing centers, that tagging mechanism fails. The thought is produced, but it is not recognized as belonging to the self.
Ah, I see.
The brain, seeking to make sense of this untagged linguistic input, misattributes it to an external source. The hallucination is not an overactive thought, it is an orphaned thought.
That is a staggering conceptual shift. The voice isn't too loud, it has just lost its signature.
Exactly.
If we zoom out and look at the whole brain of a patient with schizophrenia using our graph theory transit map, what does the global network look like?
We see a systemic collapse of efficiency. Both global and local efficiency are significantly reduced, particularly within the cognitive control networks. But the most devastating topological failure occurs within the Rich Club.
The high-speed rail connecting the major international hubs.
Yes. The major hubs, the anterior insula, the superior frontal cortex, the precuneus, lose their connections to one another. They still maintain their local feeder connections to smaller regional networks, but the long-distance, high-bandwidth communication between the hubs degrades.
So the local towns can still talk to the regional airport, but all international flights between capital cities are grounded.
Precisely. And the clinical relevance of this is absolute. The degree to which a hub like the anterior insula loses its participation coefficient, its ability to integrate across multiple networks, is directly correlated with the severity of the patient's cognitive impairment and negative symptoms. Schizophrenia is, at its core, a fragmentation of the brain's functional topology.
We've seen how a structural failure in the brain's sensory routing and rich club architecture causes the reality fracture of schizophrenia. But what happens when the networks governing our emotional regulation remain physically intact, but start communicating in toxic loops?
A very different picture.
Does a mood disorder like major depression look like a relay failure, or is it a fundamentally different kind of network collapse?
In major depressive disorder, the topological landscape is entirely different. We move away from the thalamus and the global rich club, and we focus intensely on frontal limbic connectivity and the internal architecture of the default mode network.
Let's begin with the frontal limbic circuitry, specifically the amygdala. For a clinician, the amygdala is intimately tied to threat detection and emotional salience. But again, we are not looking at an isolated lesion, we are looking at the wiring. What does the healthy, adaptive wiring of the amygdala look like?
In a healthy system, the amygdala does not operate autonomously. It maintains a strong, positive, functional connectivity with the hippocampus and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This triad works seamlessly to process an emotional stimulus, retrieve relevant contextual memories, and evaluate the immediate significance.
Okay, so the amygdala detects a loud noise, the hippocampus remembers that we're at a fireworks display, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex evaluates that we are safe.
Exactly. But the most crucial regulatory mechanism relies on a negative functional connectivity, an anti-correlation between the amygdala and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, alongside regions of the dorsal anterior cingulate.
An anti-correlation. I want to make sure I understand the mechanism here. This means that as activity in the DLPFC goes up, activity in the amygdala gets forced down.
Yes, it is the neurobiological equivalent of a top-down braking system. The prefrontal executive networks exert inhibitory control over the limbic system.
So when the amygdala initiates a distress signal, the prefrontal cortex evaluates the context. And if the threat is minimal or needs to be endured, it actively suppresses the amygdala's hyperreactivity.
Got on.
I see where this is going. What happens to that brake line in a patient with major depressive disorder?
In depression, we consistently observe severely reduced functional connectivity between the amygdala and these top-down prefrontal regulatory regions. The structural tracks might be there, but the functional coupling has failed.
So the prefrontal cortex cannot send the signal to calm down. The amygdala sounds the alarm, and the command center cannot switch it off.
The braking system has failed. And what makes this clinical reasoning so vital is that this network vulnerability is laid down remarkably early in life.
Really? How early?
Research looking at preschool-age children 4 to 6 years old who have experienced early life stress, trauma, or have a strong maternal history of depression shows this exact frontal limbic disconnectivity.
In 4-year-olds?
Yes. Long before they meet criteria for a major depressive episode, the failure of the prefrontal cortex to functionally connect with the amygdala strongly predicts elevated negative emotionality and poor emotion regulation.
The topological vulnerability precedes the clinical diagnosis by decades. That is profound.
It truly is.
Now, impaired emotion regulation explains the acute distress and depression. But a hallmark of the disorder is rumination, that crushing, inescapable gravity of negative self-evaluation. It's not just panic. It's a dark, repetitive loop of guilt and worthlessness. How does connectivity explain rumination?
To understand rumination, we must look at the default mode network, the network of the internal self. In healthy individuals, the DMN is dynamic. It activates during rest and deactivates during tasks. In depressed patients, we see severe hyperconnectivity within the anterior portion of the DMN.
So it's locked on.
Yes, but the critical pathology lies in a specific region being abnormally recruited into this network, the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, or subgenual prefrontal cortex.
Let's shine a spotlight on the subgenual prefrontal cortex. Clinically, what is its function?
It is heavily implicated in processing sadness, evaluating negative outcomes, and orchestrating behavioral withdrawal. It is the region that initiates the physiological conservation of energy when an organism is defeated or experiencing profound grief or guilt.
I'm stuck here. If the DMN is the network that runs our internal narrative, our sense of self, and the subgenual prefrontal cortex is the physical center for guilt, defeat, and withdrawal, what happens when they become hyperconnected?
They form a pathological self-sustaining loop. Think of it like a social media algorithmic echo chamber.
Oh, I like this. Walk me through the mechanism.
On social media, if an algorithm notices you engage with negative, enraging content, it rewires your feed to show you exclusively more of that content, trapping you in a toxic cycle.
Right.
In the depressed brain, the subgenual prefrontal cortex acts like that negative algorithm. Because it is hyperconnected to the DMN, every time the patient turns their attention inward to self-reflect, the neural routing immediately defaults to the subgenual regions.
So the self is inextricably computationally linked to guilt and withdrawal.
Exactly. The internal narrative cannot escape the echo chamber. The clinical manifestation of this specific topological loop is intractable rumination.
That makes complete mechanistic sense. You try to browse your own memories, and the algorithm aggressively redirects you to your worst mistakes and deepest regrets.
That's exactly how the patient experiences it.
There is one more symptom of depression I want to map: anhedonia. The complete inability to anticipate or experience pleasure or motivation. It is incredibly resistant to treatment.
For anhedonia, we look at the reward circuitry, specifically the striatum, which includes the nucleus accumbens and the caudate. In healthy individuals, the striatum communicates robustly with both the executive networks to plan goal-directed behavior and the DMN to integrate reward with the sense of self.
And in depression.
In depression, we see a profound hypoconnectivity, a disconnection between the striatum and these large-scale cortical networks.
So the reward center is isolated. If the physical sensation of a potential reward cannot functionally connect to the prefrontal cortex, the patient literally cannot form the motivation to pursue it. And if it cannot connect to the DMN, the patient cannot integrate the concept of pleasure into their identity.
Exactly. The functional isolation of the striatum perfectly mirrors the clinical isolation of anhedonia.
We have covered an immense amount of ground. We've mapped the mechanism of resting state networks, and we've seen the devastating manifestations of their collapse in schizophrenia and depression. Let's move to integration and clinical reasoning. How does this relational perspective fundamentally alter how a psychiatrist treats a patient?
It forces us to abandon the idea that we can fix a complex psychiatric illness simply by chemically targeting a single brain region. We must recognize that adaptive mental function is entirely dependent on network flexibility.
That dynamic toggling.
Right. A healthy brain dynamically balances the DMN, the executive networks, and the salience network, switching between them with fluid precision. Pathology occurs when networks become rigidly locked together, as in depressive rumination, or when they structurally fragment, as in the schizophrenic rich club collapse.
And what does the translational future look like? If we know the network topology is the true source of the illness, how do we intervene?
The horizon is incredibly promising. We are moving towards precision neuromodulation, using tools like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, guided by individualized fMRI connectivity maps. We can selectively target specific cortical hubs.
So you could target a specific node.
Yes. For a depressed patient, we might use TMS to stimulate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, specifically aiming to artificially strengthen that top-down inhibitory connection to the amygdala, functionally repairing the brake line. We're also looking at how novel pharmacotherapies, like psychedelics, act as network disruptors, temporarily dissolving rigid, hyperconnected DMN loops and allowing the brain to reorganize into healthier topologies.
We are repairing the tracks and retraining the switchboard operators.
That's the goal.
We have covered some incredibly dense, intricate clinical mechanics today. Let's do a quick mental check to see how these models hold up. I am going to present a series of clinical scenarios and puzzles functioning as our learning reinforcement. We'll explore the possibilities, I'll give you a moment to think, and then we will break down the clinical reasoning behind the solution.
Excellent idea. Let's do it.
Let's begin with a conceptual puzzle. You are a researcher analyzing a new fMRI dataset to map a patient's resting state in intrinsic networks. The software presents you with several frequency bands of spontaneous boldy fluctuations to isolate. To accurately establish functional connectivity, which frequency band must you isolate? Is it A, 1.0 to 10 Hz? Is it B, 0.01 to 0.10 Hz? Is it C, 10 to 20 Hz? Or is it D, 0.1 to 1.0 Hz? I'll give you a second to think about that.
The clinically appropriate target is B, 0.01 to 0.10 Hz. Resting state networks are fundamentally defined by these incredibly slow, low-frequency spontaneous oscillations. Frequencies higher than this are typically dominated by cardiac and respiratory physiological noise.
Excellent. Let's move to a methodological scenario. You are peer-reviewing a highly publicized neuroimaging study that claims children with a specific neurodevelopmental disorder have a fundamentally fragmented brain topology, characterized by massively increased short-range local connectivity and severely decreased long-range global connectivity. However, looking at the methodology, you immediately suspect this finding might be entirely false due to a specific distance-dependent artifact. What confounding factor caused this artifact? A. The patients fell asleep in the scanner. B. The cognitive task was too difficult. C. The patients exhibited excessive head movement. Or D. The patients kept their eyes closed. Have a think.
The critical confound is C, excessive head movement. Micromovements systematically distort the mathematical correlation of the bold D signal, artificially inflating the appearance of local connections and deflating long-range connections. It is a vital clinical trap to be aware of when evaluating literature.
Spot on. Now, for a clinical case regarding schizophrenia, you are reviewing the connectivity profile of a young adult experiencing a first episode psychosis, marked by severe sensory overload and disorganized behavior. You note a massive reduction in connectivity between the thalamus and the prefrontal cortex. To complete the classic dual miswiring signature of schizophrenia, you expect to see an increase in thalamic connectivity to which specific regions? A. The hippocampus and amygdala. B. The motor, somatosensory, and visual cortices. C. The medial posterior cingulate. Or D. The subgenual prefrontal cortex. Take a moment.
The clinical answer is B, the motor, somatosensory, and visual cortices. The thalamus becomes disconnected from the executive filtering networks of the prefrontal cortex, but hyperconnected to the primary sensory regions, directly resulting in the sensory flooding and stimulus misattribution characteristic of psychosis.
Brilliant. Let's examine the mechanics of emotional regulation. A patient with major depressive disorder presents with severe emotional lability and distress. Functional imaging reveals an isolated, highly reactive amygdala. In a healthy brain, the amygdala's threat response is normally suppressed via a negative functional connectivity and anti-correlation with a specific top-down regulatory region. Which region is failing to provide this inhibitory braking? A. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. B. The hippocampus. C. The anterior temporal poles. Or D. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Have a think about that one.
The correct region is A, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It, alongside the cognitive control networks, provides necessary top-down suppression. It is worth noting that the amygdala maintains positive connectivity with the hippocampus and ventromedial prefrontal cortex for contextual memory, but relies on the DLPFC for inhibition.
Okay, another scenario regarding depression. Your patient reports intractable rumination, an inescapable cycle of internal negative self-evaluation, and profound guilt. Based on network topology, this specific clinical symptom is most strongly predicted by an abnormal hyperconnectivity between the default mode network and which specific anatomical region? A. The anterior insula. B. The nucleus accumbens. C. The subgenual prefrontal cortex. Or D. The medial dorsal thalamus. Take a second.
The correct mechanism involves C, the subgenual prefrontal cortex. When the network governing the internal self, the DMN, becomes structurally and functionally fused to the subgenual prefrontal cortex, which processes behavioral withdrawal and guilt, the resulting echo chamber manifests as clinical rumination.
Finally, let's test our graph theory topology. You are analyzing the global transit map of a patient's brain. You identify a specific node, such as the anterior insula, that possesses a remarkably high participation coefficient. It serves as a critical junction for transferring complex information across multiple diverse networks. In graph theory terminology, what is this crucial region called? A. A feeder node. B. An isolate. C. A hub. Or D. A watershed parcel. Have a final think.
The term is C, a hub. These high-participation nodes form the elite rich club. The degradation of communication between these hubs is a central feature of the profound cognitive fragmentation seen in severe psychopathology. And for an exhaustive review of these models in mathematics, I strongly direct listeners back to Chapter 1.28 of Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
We have journeyed deep into the invisible architecture of the mind today, from the slow, rhythmic pulse of the resting state to the algorithmic echo chambers of depression and the shattered transit hubs of psychosis. I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought as you return to your clinical practice. If our very reality, our thoughts, our profoundest emotions, and our sanity itself is dictated not merely by the physical tissue of our brain, but by the ephemeral, invisible rhythms of communication between that tissue, what does the future of healing look like? As our technologies evolve, will we eventually move beyond broad chemical adjustments and learn instead to directly, precisely conduct the electrical symphony of the human mind? It is an awe-inspiring horizon.
It truly is.
Here are the details of this episode.
Functional brain connectivity and psychopathology. Byline. When connections define reality, how patterns of communication shape mental health and disorder.